The reason I chose the legal profession was the advent of television, which for some people, I'm that old that television actually came along while I was a young person and was unheard of. So the idea now, of course, every house, every mobile phone's got it. But then it was very rare, and I used to have to go to a friend's to watch it. But there was a series on, and I was captivated by the series called The Defenders, American series, about a father and a son, and defending and investigating serious social issues which ended up in court. So it wasn't just about the court case. The court case was right at the end, obviously, but most of it was about getting to know the person, what sort of things motivated the person, and why they wanted litigation. They might be defendants in a criminal case, but they might be suing somebody for environmental damage or whatever. And I think it was the process of getting inside somebody else's, if you like, shoes, finding out how they ticked, and saying to myself, yeah, I quite like to do that. Articulate for somebody else, particularly those unused to doing it. And it's not about winning. Winning helps, but actually it's about providing an avenue of representation so they feel they've had their say. They feel that somebody's listened. So I thought, that's for me. It started when human rights wasn't really a very common phrase, although everybody knew about it. It wasn't on everybody's tongue, and it wasn't an agenda, certainly not an agenda in the United Kingdom that relied on common law and rights derived in a different way, Magna Carta, for example. So there was an assumption, quite false in my view, that actually, British society was underpinned well enough and that we didn't need a charter, a declaration of human rights, if you like the European Convention or the United Nations Declaration. And so I came at it a slightly different way. I didn't come at it from the point of view of that legislation. It's like Topsy, it kind of grew incrementally by doing cases where people were unjustly accused or people were unjustly, as it were, jeopardized by their lifestyles or their economic situation, that they were disadvantaged. And I realized I'd had a very disadvantaged upbringing myself. It wasn't particularly grand. It was a 2 up, 2 down in North London, and I went to a respectable but not one of the major public schools. My father sort of almost bled himself to death to send me there. Well, fine, and that was very kind of him. But, I realized all of that was pretty privileged. And I lived in one house all my life, and, it was sheltered. And then you step outside, and going to Keele University, not only was getting in there, but once I was there, and you look around the Pottery, still an extraordinarily poor area of the United Kingdom, one of the poorest areas still. It was then. I'd never seen anything like it. I couldn't believe the conditions in which people were living and working, particularly women. And so I sort of woke up to, if you like, injustice from the ground level, from the grassroots. It's not rocket science, actually. And the term has become abused, mostly by tabloids who feel, people are exploiting them. Well, I don't think that's right. I think it's very important. Even in the United States, they have this, every man, woman and child has a card on which their rights are written. And the rights are important for enabling you to create a space for yourself. A space in which you think, breathe, live, speak and so on, according to your soul. And that you're not determined by someone else saying this is how you've got to think, this is how you've got to act. Which is, of course, the totalitarian way. And that's why I'm really bothered about the legislation that is being proposed by this government at the moment for basically tracking our every life, our every move. Well, I'm against all of that. I'm not against tracking crime and tracking terrorists, but I am against the idea that in order to do that, you sort of bulk survey. This is Animal Farm. This is Orwellian. This is exactly what he was talking about. And everybody was shock horror. We're living in it now, and people actually don't think, oh, well, why should we be bothered? And I go, well, I'm sorry. It's rather like, I think Snowden said in the first place, why should we be bothered if we haven't got anything to hide? Well, it's rather like saying, why should we bother about freedom of speech if we've got nothing to say? I mean, are we slowly withering and on the vine? So my whole consuming interest was to ensure that the battles that have been fought to get us to where we are now, where there are certain recognition of certain rights, which have obligations, it's not just a right, to privacy, free speech, association, fair trial. The major one is life, which is so easily expendable. I mean, you look around the world, how many places where people are locked up, executed, whatever, because life has become expendable. And once we treat life as expendable, then I'm not quite sure why we were here at all. So that's the momentum, that's the life force. In order to decide whether a case I did, say, 30 years could have had could have had a different outcome, I'd obviously have to go back and find the scientists to have a look at the evidence and tell me whether they think they could have had a different outcome. Potentially, with the advent of particularly DNA and so on, yes, I say potentially because I personally feel there's been too much reliance placed on forensic science, because it's not written in tablets of stone. At the end of the day, science, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. So it's as much an art as it is a science. Mistakes are made, fingerprinting mistakes, DNA mistakes. It's not that the science is fallible. The science itself isn't fallible. Our hands and fingers are all different. So that's not the problem. Problem is not in the science of comparing the whirls and twirls on my little finger with what's on a piece of paper, because clearly they're capable of being compared. The question is, who does the comparison? And what is it they're comparing? And are they looking at the same items? And are the same number of ridge characteristics, used to be 16, are they the same? So you begin to see how the subjective element of science intrudes, and so that it's not as objective as I think one imagines. Therefore, the answer to your question is, I really don't know whether science would have made a huge difference. The difference, I think, doesn't lie within science. It lies in another field in which all of us, lawyers and judges and legislators, have slowly woken up through some of the cases that I did myself, miscarriages of justice, like the Guildford 4, Birmingham 6, Judith Ward, Tottenham 3, Cardiff 3. The miscarriages were brought about by police forces who really were committed to the usual suspects. And actually, what they were doing, never mind forensic science, was they decided on who they thought was guilty, and who probably was guilty of something, but not the one being charged. So it's what they call sort of the noble rot, if you like, we've got the right person for the wrong crime sort of approach. And I never approved of that. But anyway, that's what was going wrong. And that's what went wrong in the Birmingham case. That, they got the wrong people, because up here they had prejudices and preconditions about who was guilty. I think in every case, whatever the result, the full truth, some cases reveal the full truth, but often there's a bigger story to be told. And I think in all cases, the bigger story always surfaces. Now, it may not happen within the lifetime of the person concerned, so it may be a historical revelations, and there are historical revelations, surface all the time. So in relation to Diana and Dodi, where I haven't made my views secret at all, I actually think there wasn't a plan to murder her, but there certainly was a plan to ensure that the relationship ended. and some injury was caused, but it got out of hand. That's my approach to it. Other people have other theories about it. However you look at it, whether you think it's murder, manslaughter, and the jury did not return a verdict of accident. That's not what they said. Even though the police may wish it had been that, that's not what they said. They said it was unlawful killing, basically caused by following vehicles, and also the behaviour of the driver. Now, there are big questions that arose in the inquest that have never ever been answered, and I think still have to be answered somewhere along the line that do relate to this. I'll give you two examples of questions which still bother me. One is, Henri Paul, the driver, was receiving huge sums of money, which were tracked by the British police, but they could never find where they come from. They certainly didn't come from his being a chauffeur at the Ritz. I go no further. Second thing is, a man who reputedly was in the tunnel as a photographer, called James Danson. He's British, but lived in France for a long time. Always happened to be at the scene of some interesting things that were going on. Who claimed, according to some, that he got photographs of what happened in the Alma Tunnel. Anyway, whether he did have all that or not, his death is, in my opinion, extraordinary. That he travels hundreds of miles from Paris in his car to a plateau region called Larsac in south of France, where he buys some petrol in a nearby petrol station and then goes to a very quiet section of forest on the plateau, sets light to himself having locked the car, commits suicide. I don't wear that. I've asked many people, it's only anecdotal, if you're going to commit suicide, how would you do it? And the last thing they do is burn themselves alive, unless you're making a public demonstration, and he wasn't doing that. So I don't believe it was suicide, I never have, and I think there's a link inside that story to what happened in the Alma Tunnel. There's a link in the money that was coming into the driver to what happened in the tunnel. Now, there are a large number of other questions that are still hanging in the air after the inquest. And I think the answers to those questions will slowly unravel over the next maybe 50 years. So I'll have long gone, but I'm pretty sure they will come out. You have to be able to look at the audience you're addressing. So here it might be you two or whatever. I have to look at you. So first thing is look at the person. Don't look up there and all around. And look at the person. See whether they're actually listening to what you're saying. So the first thing is look at them. Second thing is, who are they? So if it's possible to do a little bit of research beforehand so you know who they are. Obviously, if you do know them already, that helps. And obviously, if you're seeing the same judge most days of the week, you've probably worked out who he is by the time you've been in front of him for 6 years. So, or her. So, knowing the person a bit, so you know what it is that's going to chime with their approach. Now, if you've got a jury of 12, that's tricky because you've got a much bigger audience. And if you've got a whole audience of people, you can still do it because there's people who come together collectively have a personality. In fact, all the individual personalities come together. And a whole audience has a personality. It'll differ. Comedians will probably have worked this one out, that they may go to the same theatre but with the same numbers of people, but it'll be an entirely different audience. And some nights it just goes, it's not working. Now, it may not be working because maybe they're not on form and the wrong jokes or something. But so I think touching the audience, so you've looked at them, you've worked out who they are, and then they've got to know who you are. It's no use, pontificating. They've got to know that you're just an ordinary person. And so telling personal stories about yourself, against yourself, I think are extremely... So they begin to engage with you and think, oh yeah, because I think that's the other thing some people say about me. They say, we didn't realise actually you're actually very approachable, and actually you're quite funny now and again. And I say, yeah, that's that's it. It's because people have an image of somebody else. You've got to break down the image and say, look, I'm not actually like that, if that's what you think. And I did it once in a very strange way. At a party, somebody came up and said, you're Michael Mansfield. I said, no, I'm not. What? I said, I'm his brother, Edward. Oh, you're his brother. Oh, right. Well, what's it like? I said, dreadful. He's a right arsehole. He is arrogant, actually, and his views, socialism and all the rest of it, gets on our wit. You'd think he never goes to sleep and talks about it. And as for all the work he does in the law, God, I wish he'd shut up, something like that. And of course this guy said, it's really good to meet you, and he shook my hand and he walked away. He walked away to another group of people over there. He just said, do you know who I've been talking to? That's Mike Mansfield's brother. And they go, sorry, that is him. And so, it was one of those, it was perhaps a bit mean, but it's again just, you've got to touch them. You've got to get in there and do it against yourself. This may sound a little bit, arrogant for me to say it about myself, but one of the most pleasing rewards of the whole of my career hasn't been necessarily that, I'm a QC and all that. It's been that ordinary people in the street just come up very regularly. They don't always remember exactly who I am, which is also quite comforting. But they know, yeah, you're that lawyer person. You go, yeah. Sometimes they get the name wrong. It doesn't really matter. They said, and then they come out with a story, and it is usually about something I've done. Sometimes I've been involved with them. Sometimes I haven't. And so I think when you hear the stories of people that maybe I met 30 years ago, and they said, we've always remembered, funnily enough, how you made me feel. You made me feel that I've got to do this. It may be young barristers or young other lawyers. And I think, therefore, getting inside life and being positive, not negative, positive about what can be achieved, that you can not only make people feel good, but feel sufficiently good that they can make a difference. Because most people feel disempowered and they don't think they can do anything. They say, what difference does it make whether we do this? And I always say it makes all the difference. But you won't know now what difference you've made. You may never know. In my case, I'm very fortunate. I do know because people come up and say, I've made that difference. I'm lucky. I've lived long enough for people to do the full circle and come and say, wow, that was good.